Howell, Managing Director of the World Economic Forum's Risk Response Network, joins me in the studio now. Lee, thanks very much indeed for coming into the studio. A whole plethora of risks in this report. I mean, you've got every category covered. We're not just talking about the economy here, we're talking social protest, environmental. One thing that we were talking about just a couple of minutes ago, the soaring price of orange juice. We're seeing this in the futures markets and also in cocoa. And the thing that we always talk about when we look ahead this year is the Eurozone crisis and economic imbalances. But what is the likelihood of something like this coming along and pretty much changing the rules of the game, changing the dynamics, much as, say, the Arab Spring did last year?
Unfortunately, the significance is quite high in the sense that well, first, there are a lot of risks, and we're all aware about that. But I think what we try to do with this report is to help policymakers and even citizens understand and appreciate these risks in a particular context. So there are 5 categories. So we focus on economic risks, 10 risks around the economic space. We look at societal risks, technological risks, environmental risks. The problem, though, and geopolitical risks, the problem, though, is that these risks don't run independent of one another. In fact, the economic risks play out and impact the environmental risks. Particularly environmental risks may exacerbate geopolitical risks. So that's what, that's kind of, unfortunately, that's the world we live in, a very interdependent and complex world. And to your point about the commodities and such, I think, you do see in certain parts of the world...
I mean, that's something that we saw. I mean, speaking about the sort of interlinkages, of course, we speak about the political causes of, say, the unrest in the Middle East last year, but then, commodity costs rising, food prices rising, families being worried about essentially putting food on the table, subsidies being taken away. We're seeing protests now in Nigeria. This could be, well, an interesting year for social protest.
Absolutely. Well, and you've just described a lot of really pocketbook issues, right? I mean, a lot of these things are at core. There's no substitute for water. If we have a problem in water, it will be severe. People need, they want to be able to get to work by means of transport, not see, gasoline prices double because subsidies pulled away.
Yeah.
Very difficult. But it gets to something, I think, more acute, though, and that is many of these governments are running big deficits. And in the report, we highlight one of the center of gravity's risks that really systemically are important are chronic fiscal imbalances, both in the developing world and, of course, in the industrialized world, most severely in the industrialized world. And what's actually disappointing is that, particularly in the OECD context, many of the top economies that have this really, the writing's on the wall with respect to their fiscal position, the political leadership is kicking the can, sort of the can down the road. We're seeing governments would prefer to create committees to look at and study and come up with recommendations on cut the deficits. We see others bringing in technocrats. These chronic fiscal imbalances are very real, and they, if not managed...
These technocratic governments have been hailed as a sign of progress as well. I'm talking about for the countries here in Europe, at least, Italy and Greece, no?
Well, is it I think when we see the response I think there is some success. At least we're getting people who really understand the economics and the severity of the position, the balance sheets of those countries, certainly. But at the same time, what does it mean in terms of a citizen's faith in the political system? They've elected officials. Actually, that's what you've empowered these officials these leaders to serve in parliaments and to make the tough decisions. That's what we expect of leaders. I mean, at one level, we expect the people we put in office to make the tough calls. Is it right that in many cases that the tough calls are basically put in abeyance or actually given to some other group to study further? I'm not so sure in the long term that's a healthy outcome.
You speak about the fiscal imbalance, economic imbalances, but particularly the poor fiscal position of many governments on both sides of the Atlantic. Are you sensing more of an acceptance on the part of the public, on the part of the populace, that things are going to change? Are expectations being adjusted to this new normal that we keep on talking about?
Unfortunately not. I think there's 2 issues here. One, there's a large group of people who think that this is still cyclical, that we can get out of this through the normal sort of cycle and counter-cyclical measures, when it's really structural. And if it's structural, that's going to be tough. And we're seeing that in some of the major economies. And then, of course, there's the demographic question. And we're really seeing a distortion there where we have people entering in retirement age, wondering about their pension systems and the social contracts there, and we're seeing younger people trying to enter the workforce who are saying, hey, where's the opportunity? And that could lead to a dystopian future where people don't really have a hope for the future at both scales of the population, both young and old.
And I mean, we were just speaking about the unrest in the Middle East last year. It gets me thinking about youth unemployment. You know, that was a factor in the unrest
Right.
that we saw in that region. I'm just wondering how much of a problem it's going to be this time, perhaps, for developed economies, Western economies this year, because this is, I mean, do you think there is a recognition on the part of policymakers that youth unemployment is reaching crisis levels in some countries?
Absolutely, and what you're alluding to is the situation, for example, in Spain, where we see record high unemployment on the young people, over 20, 30, close to 40%.
Here in the UK as well.
And the UK as well. In the US, I think that's something that it's a tough call. Now, here's why we're in a jam, because we know that at the same time, we're dealing with some austerity measures, and we have to bring the government budgets under control. At least that's what the bond markets are insisting on. But at the same time, we have to look out for the people, and particularly young citizens. We have to have, leaders have to give them a sense of the future. We need them to be aspirational, and that's not, we need confidence in the economy.
Are we looking at a lost generation?
Too soon to tell. I think that's where leadership comes in. This can be reversed. This is not, this is where leadership, this is where our leaders earn their keep.
Lee Howell, Managing Director of the World Economic Forum's Risk Response Network. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maryam.